What's up, and welcome back to another episode of Gizmo Slip Tech. Today, it's the SCAR 18 versus the GT77. It is a glorious benchmark comparison that we'll be doing today. We'll also be talking about the main differences between these two laptops. We're going to go over the specs, and then we're going to be breaking down side-by-side split screen benchmarks as well as a split screen and analysis to see which laptop is in fact faster. Now, the units that we have today are the SCAR 18 for $38.99, and in a dual load, this is supposed to go from 55 to 65 watts, but we saw way higher wattage than that in actual gameplay, which is super interesting to me. Now, in CPU only loads, we were looking at 140 to 175 watts. It starts out up to 175 and then it throttles down to 140 after about 2 minutes or so, and then it stays at 140. Now, our Cinebench scores were with a minus 30 undervolt, but from my understanding is that now Asus has launched a new BIOS that lets you undervolt up to 80 millivolts. So be interesting to see the performance. These tests were not done with that new BIOS though, so keep that in mind. Now, the RTX 4090 is in both of these laptops. They both have the same CPU. The biggest difference, in my opinion, between these two laptops is how the laptops are tuned, though, between the CPU and GPU, and then also how the laptop thermally is cooled. Like, the CPU cooling on the SCAR 18 is a bit better, and the GPU cooling on the GT77 is a bit better, in my opinion. Now, the other huge difference is the 18-inch QHD 240Hz 494 nits, 88% DCI-P3 color gamut, 850 to 1 contrast ratio on the SCAR 18. That 240 Hz QHD is gorgeous. It's a very nice display, but the contrast ratio is not going to be nearly as high as you'll see on the GT77, and the brightness is not as high either. The color gamut is also slightly behind. Now, with the color gamut, I did measure it with my Spider 5 Elite right here, and it is not as high a color gamut as for example, the GT77. Sorry, the Spider 5 Elite always underestimates the color gamut by about 10%, is what I've seen. So I'm guessing the actual DCI-P3 color gamut is closer to 100%, like probably like 97%, somewhere in that range. So it's obviously a very bright, very vibrant display on both of these laptops, but the GT77 display is noticeably better. Now, you do get G-Sync and Advanced Optimus with the SCAR 18, which is going to be an advantage in certain titles, especially if you like having G-Sync. I'm personally not. I didn't notice the difference at all between these two laptops in terms of G-Sync or not. We did test both these laptops in dedicated GPU only mode, so keep that in mind. Now, you do get regular Advanced Optimus on the GT77, and you can swap between dedicated GPU mode, normal Optimus, which will cause a slight CPU bottleneck, but at 4K resolution, it's going to be very minimal, right? It's not as big at high resolutions, and it's only really going to be visible in esports games primarily, and as a result, I just don't think it's that big of a deal. Lacking Advanced Optimus or G-Sync on the GT77 is like small bananas, and I can understand why MSI would cut it, because it does not impact performance or user functionality very much. Now, you get faster DDR5 4800 megahertz RAM on the SCAR 18, and you get 2 terabytes of SSD in RAID 0, whereas on the GT77 you get one 2 terabyte SSD, which is going to be a little better for upgrading down the line. If you want to add 2 more SSDs, you don't have to take one of the 2 SSDs out like in the SCAR 18. And also, you only have the 2 M.2 slots in the SCAR 18, where you get 3 M.2 slots in the GT77. The ports are also noticeably fewer on the SCAR 18. We're going to go over some of the changes here in a moment, but also notice the weight. The weight is 6.83 pounds. That is going to be noticeably lighter, about a ½ pound lighter than what the GT77 is. And as far as dimensions go, let me go ahead and just show you. I've got the Strix G18, which is the exact same dimensions as the SCAR 18, and sitting them side by side here for you, you can see, I'm gonna line this up at the front, and you can see how much deeper the GT77 is. They're almost exactly the same width, but in terms of depth, the GT77's got this extra butt on the back, and that does help with the cooling. It has extra 2 It has a total of 4 fans in the GT77, where the Scar 18 only has 3 fans. And I would say the fan setup just is better in general on the Scar 18, but you get liquid metal conductinaut on the Scar 18. Sorry, I believe the fan setup is better on the. I believe the fan setup is a bit better on the GT77, but because the Scar 18 has liquid metal conductinaut, it does provide an additional cooling effectiveness that I really love. So yeah, we'll have to see. You'll see the temperatures and everything side by side here in a moment. So jumping back over, let's take a look at what the GT77's specs are. So here's the GT77, all right? You get the same i9 13980HX in here. Under a dual load, we did see 75 watts being pulled quite often, but like I said, the Scar 18 did more than that very often, and even the GT77 did more than 75 pretty often, but that would usually cause the laptop GPU to be dropping down to like 150 to 160 watts in very CPU-bound games, and then we would see this boost up even above 75. Now, in a CPU-only load, we saw like basically 2 bursts up to 200 watts at the beginning, like 207 I think might have been the highest I saw, but 189 was very common. And then after a short period of time, we would see it drop down to 175, 165, and then 152. It would stick at 152 for a little while, and then it would go down to 135 after several minutes. And we did hit thermal throttling in Cinebench R23, especially when we were hitting the higher levels of the wattage pulls. And that's one thing that we saw on the Scar 18. We did see some very high temperatures when it was going to 175 at the beginning, but then it would pull back to 140 and it would not be thermal throttling at all. We would be like well below thermal throttling, closer to this 80-85 degree range, where on the GT77 we weren't thermal throttling at all at 135 either, but it was not as great. You'll see here in a little bit. I would say that in general, the Scar 18 has slightly better cooling out of the box for CPU only loads. But the thing is, the GT77 has unlocked undervolting, so you can undervolt that sucker as much as you can, as much as you want, and therefore you're able to get a little bit more performance out of the processor, especially if you get a really good silicon lottery pull on the i9 13980HX. Now, this RTX 4090, it goes up to 175 watts, just like the Scar 18, but it does sometimes pull only 150 in CPU-bound games. 64 gigs of DDR5, 4000 megahertz is what we got in this unit. But if you go with the 128 gig version with all 4 SODIMM slots being filled, then it goes down to 3600. Okay, so that's important to know that your speed will go down as your total size goes up. And I would actually love to see MSI offer a 32 gig option with like 4800 or maybe 5600 megahertz support if they can, if the hardware does support it. I know the Intel chipset does support it, but I'm not sure if their motherboard can support that given the 4X SODIMM slots. Our display is a 4K 144 hertz 17.3 inch display, 783 nits brightness measured in SDR mode. So we're extremely bright. Now, it's supposed to go over 1000 nits in HDR mode, but I can't really test that with my Spider 5 Elite, so this is how I can test it. We got 92% as rated by the Spider 5 Elite with 100% or 92% DCI-P3 color gamut, but like I said with the Spider 5 Elite, it really means that you're getting closer to 100% P3 color gamut coverage, which is just excellent. Now, the color contrast ratio is 783,000 to 1. Which is extremely high. This screen goes extremely black when it's a all black screen with no backlight bleed at all on the GT77. I love the display on the GT77, but at 144 hertz and at 4K, there is a slower response time. I don't have a tool to measure the slower response time, but you'll see it. I'll talk about it here in a moment when we get into Apex Legends. Now, it comes with a 2TB SSD for $46.99. And you get 1 free M.2 Gen 5 slot, and you get one of these M.2 Gen 4 slots is being filled. So you have a total of 3 slots with the GT77. and you have 2 open slots, most importantly. So for upgrading, the GT77 is going to be a bit better. You don't have to take any SSDs out like you do with the SCAR 18, because if you take one of those SSDs out, then your RAID 0 is gone. You have to reinstall Windows with your SCAR 18. And you also have to lose one of the gigs, right? So that's another downside. Now you get an extra Thunderbolt 4, you get an extra USB-A on the GT77, and you get a mini display port and a full-size SD card reader. We were doing, I think, 86 megabytes a second, which is pretty good, but it's not as fast as the faster UHS 2 cards that you can get on like the Blade 18, which was doing over 170 megabytes per second. Now, this does have Windows Hello, where the SCAR 18 does not have Windows Hello. They both have 720p webcams, and you can see that this has a slightly bigger watt-hour battery, but with the mini LED display, I'm not expecting there to be too much of a difference in battery life. You're going to get probably 3 to 5 hours of battery life on both of these units, depending on how you optimize, maybe a little bit more in a super optimized environment, like an office type environment. Maybe you can push 6 to 7 hours, but most of the time I would expect 3 to 5, depending on how you optimize these laptops. Now, just reviewing the key differences between the GT77 and the SCAR 18. The GT77 has an amazing mechanical keyboard. All right, it feels better than the SCAR 18, but I like the layout of the SCAR 18 a little better. The number pad is not as cramped on the SCAR 18. The brighter, more vibrant, better contrast 4K 144 hertz display on the GT77 is just better. It's a better display, except for esports, because the faster response rate on the SCAR 18 means that you can quickly respond to enemies and new input data for competitive type games. So if you're a competitive gamer, I do recommend the SCAR 18 over the GT77 because of the screen response time and the slight ghosting you get with the 4K 144 hertz display. For casual gamers, though, the GT77 display is definitely the far better display, because you get smooth, graphical goodness that is so colorful, bright, and vibrant with high levels of contrast on the GT77. I highly recommend this laptop for casual gamers. It's definitely the best laptop display I've ever seen so far, aside from maybe the Acer Predator Helios 500 mini LED that's a QHD 250 hertz. So yeah, now we have, of course, better ports on the GT77, bigger screen on the SCAR 18. The SCAR 18 has better CPU thermals, meaning that it's able to pull a little bit higher wattage and have a little lower temperatures in CPU-only loads. We were getting like maybe about 5 to 10 degrees Celsius cooler on the on the SCAR 18 in a comparable load. Now, in actual gameplay, though, we were seeing the SCAR 18 pull way higher levels of wattage, and the GT77 pulled lower wattage with lower temperatures and still managed to get better frames in some games and not in others. It was really weird, odd performance. You'll see here in a moment. Now, the GT7 is a larger laptop and weighs a little bit more. The GT77 has a PCIe Gen 5 SSD slot, so there's very few Gen 5 SSDs to actually buy and put in your laptop, especially in a laptop SSD type. There's some desktop Gen 5s that I saw, but yeah, if you're after more total SSD space, then the GT77 is going to be the way to go. The 4X SODIMM slots are up to 128 gigs. So if you need 128 gigs of DDR5 memory, then the GT77's got an advantage there. But the faster memory on the SCAR 18 should provide better performance in memory-sensitive games in theory. But we're going to get to some of those benchmarks here in a moment, and you can see that the GT77 still kicks some tail in some of those games that are normally memory sensitive. Now, the SCAR 18, I also want to mention that it's a little easier to open the bottom panel. I think the GT77 could be designed a little better to make it a little more accessible to the bottom panel. All right, so for Cinebench R23 10-minute throttled score, we got 31,540 for the GT77 with a minus 125 millivolt undervolt on the cores, minus 75 on the ring, minus 125 on the E cores. So that's very good and significantly higher than what we got on the SCAR 18 with only a minus 30 millivolt undervolt. 29,890 for that SCAR 18. The Strix G18 coming in at a lower price point and similar levels of performance, though, makes the G18 a better bang for the buck for sure. Now, For Timespy graphics, we got 22,587, and that's all stock out of the box. The Scar 18 though, we're running in manual fan mode, and that had a slight overclock to it with plus 50 megahertz on the GPU clock for all of these tests that we did today, and plus 100 memory overclock. And I include this because this is the stock value included in the default fan profile set. If the GT77 though still had a better score, because overall, basically this RTX 4090 is factory overclocked out of the box. Like, we're getting higher clock speeds in everything with the GT77 because it's just tuned to a higher level of base performance. And you'll see how that affects some of the performance. Like the GPU bound games are noticeably higher levels of performance for the most part in the GT77. But the CPU-bound games, some of those is where the Scar 18 can shine with its higher power limit on the CPU, and the faster overall memory speed does give the Scar 18 some wins here today. So moving on, you can see the actual Timespy results. And I just want to jump back real quick and look at these temps. 59 degrees on the Scar 18, 55 on the GT77. 64 on the Scar 18, 59 on the GT77. And they're pulling about the same level of wattage here. This is just the start of the test, but it's still interesting. Both of these laptops were entirely tested in manual fan mode and extreme performance mode with the highest level of tuning and overclocking. The highest base level of performance, no overclock on the GT77, but the Scar 18 did have that, plus 50, plus 100 overclock. That's the default baked into Armory Crate. So 13,583 for Port Royale and 14,284 for GT77 in Port Royale. So that tests your ray tracing performance. We're getting a little bit more performance out of the GT77. So here's the 10-minute run, and you can see some of the performance that we got on these the laptops and the temperatures side by side. The Scar 18 just doing really well, except that you couldn't undervolt it, and that's why the score was a little bit lower on the Scar 18 than it was on the GT77 Titan. Now with a RAID 0, you can see the RAID 0 read and write speeds are going to be faster on the GT77. The read and write speeds are going to be faster on the Scar 18 at 10.7K and 8.5K and 6.7K, 4.9K on the GT77. And that's because this is RAID 0, this is not RAID 0. So that definitely makes a big difference. Now we did the Geekbench CPU and GPU tests. And I don't really put much stock in here, but I don't put much stock in this benchmark at all, but I included it anyway because I know some people like to see it. So you can see for multi-core scores, we got 17,385. And for single core scores, I think the Scar 18 actually beat it by like about 30 to 40 points. It's not being shown here. I guess we need to work on our editing skills, but I'm not going to change that right now. But it's about 30 points more on the Scar 18. All right, so our GPU compute was all over the place, though. It was really odd performance for the GPU compute. We got 213,000 on the GT77 and only 93,000 on the Scar 18. So not sure what's going on with that. Now we're moving on to Dying Light 2 for our first game benchmark. And man, this is an interesting one. I want to point out some key differences. We're pulling about the same level of GPU utilization and wattage levels, around 160 to 170 watts in the GPU. But the CPU power draw on the Scar 18 is a little bit higher quite often, like 79 right there, 77, and only 53 over here on the GT77 Titan. And I think the reason for this, if I were to be guessing, is that the memory speed on the Scar 18 is letting the CPU fly a little bit further. And then we're therefore not getting quite as CPU bottlenecked as we are on the GT77. And that's what's allowing the Scar 18 to push slightly higher frame rates in this game, despite the GPU actually have a higher clock speed over here, 2200 versus about 2000 on the Scar 18. And yet we're still doing more frames on the Scar 18. Now this was tested with ray tracing on ultra, DLSS on quality, and frame generation enabled. So that's why if you notice these, for Dying Light does not count the actual frame rate properly. but it does look like 120 frames per second smoothness, even though it's saying we're only getting 60 over here on the actual graph. But overall, either way, both laptops are going to absolutely crush the performance levels to play this game. It's going to easily play Dying Light 2, and yeah, it's going to be a great overall gaming experience on either one of these. Interesting, our 1% low is quite a bit better on the GT77 at 91, but I wouldn't really worry too much about that because we're jumping between a bunch of different benchmark areas. We might get some loading stutters here. But overall, the Scar 18 does win the Dying Light 2 test. Moving on to Dead Space, the Titan did 130 versus the 112 for the Scar 18. And here's such an interesting benchmark because look at our wattage. I just paused right here. We got 156 watts to the GPU on the Scar 18, 158 on the GT77 Titan, only 93% utilization on the Titan. Like the clock speed on the CPU is higher on the Scar 18 and a much higher wattage, 108 watts right now to the Scar 18 versus 76 to the GT77. And yet the GT77 is still doing the much higher frames per second. So it's a really odd gameplay result because you'd expect the higher wattage, the higher clock speed on the CPU here in this very CPU heavy game is going to push the frames higher, but it's not. It didn't. The actual result was higher on the GT77, which shows, I guess, that we are GPU bound in this scenario, and we do get the higher clock speed over here on the GT77, and that pushes our frame rate up much higher, up to 130 here versus 112. So very interesting result in that game. And so moving on now, Warzone 2. So we tested this thing all on low. We got 157 on the Scar 18, 156 on the Titan, and it's essentially a tie. Both are performing excellently, and both are pulling high levels of wattages on the CPU. Notice we're doing almost 100 watts over here on the Titan, 123 watts over here on the Scar 18. And I also want to point out that I did do some testing on this with extreme settings enabled, which is maximum settings, and I was getting about the same frames per second here as low. We were getting about 151, I believe, on extreme settings. So really turning this game up to maximum versus having it on low is such a small performance hit, and it doesn't look that different either. Low still looks really good. This is a weird game in terms of performance, but I had a lot of fun playing Warzone, and it played really great on both laptops. But again, the higher refresh rate display on the Scar 18 does give it just a slight advantage in terms of response rate and quickness of actual using, actually responding to the enemies coming onto the display. But I can still play esports games just fine on the GT77. It's just not quite as quick a response, which if you're super competitive, that'll make the difference. Now, the Scar 18 wins in Cyberpunk 2077. It gets about 4 FPS higher. And the interesting thing here is, once again, we're pulling much higher wattages on the Scar 18 for at least portions of it. We're doing about the same in the 70s and 80s inside the building, but when we go outside of this building, you'll see much higher CPU utilization on this Scar 18. So focus on this number right here. As we go out here where there's tons of NPCs in the open world, you'll see that number spike up on the Scar 18, and you'll also see higher frames on the Scar 18, I believe, just by a few. So the current frames here, it's very close overall performance between these two in the Cyberpunk 2077. But just in general, I would say the Scar 18 is just going to win out just by a little bit because of that increased CPU TDP and memory speed is, again, my thoughts here. But it's a very small win overall, only 4 FPS overall between these two laptops in Cyberpunk 2077. So moving on to Watch Dogs Legion. Now this one is the game that pulled the highest CPU wattage level on the Scar 18. We're going to be doing everything on Ultra, ray tracing on Ultra, DLSS on Quality, QHD Plus for all of these benchmarks as always. And I missed what the average is there. I'm just going to back up for just a moment there. So 86 FPS on the Scar 18 and 90 on the Titan. So even though we're pulling much higher wattages over here on the Scar 18, 127 watts on the CPU to only 95, 97 watts over here on the Titan. And so we're doing like 30, anywhere from 20 to 40 more wattage through the CPU on the SCAR 18. And yet our FPS is actually a little bit higher on the GT77, which is just so incredibly weird to me. Um, like, why? It's interesting. It basically, fundamentally, it means that we're being mainly GPU bound, at least GPU bound enough to make up the performance difference. Because like right now, you look at the actual FPS, we're doing 4 or 5 more FPS in the GT77 through that area, almost 10 FPS more now on the GT77. But I guess as we're pulling back and we're getting more NPCs into the mix, that's where the SCAR 18 starts matching the performance closer. No, it's not really. It's still doing more. Okay, now it's matching the performance a little bit closer, only like a few FPS difference, like a 2 or 3, 4, 5 FPS difference, and sometimes occasionally matching it. So interesting on the performance difference between these two laptops, because it's not what I would have expected. I would expect that the Legion would, Watch Dogs Legion would actually perform a little better on the SCAR 18, maybe. But the CPU bound, it's not CPU bound enough to actually make the performance gains, and the GT77 ekes out that win. Now we're doing God of War, everything on ultra settings, DLSS on quality, and the Titan once again wins out. Now this is a GPU bound game, so you would expect in any GPU bound titles to have better performance on the GT77 Titan, and we did see that. So that's good. 124 FPS versus 116. Moving on to CSGO. Now, we did the CSGO workshop benchmark, and we got 548 on the Titan and 513 on the SCAR 18. And I believe this is because most of the time the game is GPU bound, but then when you get down into things like the smoke, the game becomes CPU bound. So it all depends on which part of the game that you're actually in. And MSI Afterburner is not compatible with the CSGO. That's why we don't have the overlay, because they want to prevent cheating, so they don't allow any overlays. But look in particular at our FPS numbers as we go through this smoke. It's interesting. One, like popping in here, our really lows here are so similar between these two laptops. There's very little difference, and so you'd have to actually measure it out. But overall, it's obviously going to be excellent performance on the SCAR 18 or the GT77. I mean, you're going to get way over 250 FPS or 240 FPS like on the SCAR 18 in CSGO. So now we're doing everything on Ultra, DLSS on quality, frame generation enabled, and we're running through Hogsmeade, which is the most NPC dense area of this game. And you can see that we're getting quite a few more FPS over here on the SCAR 18. We're getting 91 versus about 80. And you look at the CPU wattages here, notice it's 99 watts utilization on the SCAR 18 and 64 watts on the GT77 Titan. So we're pulling more wattages through the GT77 Titan, and we're being less GPU bound. We're getting 77% utilization on the SCAR 18 and only 54% utilization on the GT77. So if I were to bring that back, you can just focus on the GPU utilization. You'll see that I believe the memory speeds and the higher CPU wattage in games is basically helping prevent the game from being as CPU bound on the SCAR 18, which is good for a game like Hogwarts. Now, in most areas of the game, you're not going to be as CPU bound, and in that scenario, the GT77 might be able to come back or match performance with the SCAR 18 much better, but it's just going to depend on what area of the game that you're in. So hopping over into Apex Legends, we're going to do everything on low, and you can see kind of the level of ghosting a little bit on the GT77 over here. You can kind of see it's a little bit of after images here and there. And I mean, I guess you can kind of see it a little on the SCAR 18, but as a person actually using the display that can see the full frame rate, I can definitely say that in terms of aiming precisely and quickly, the Scar 18 is going to be the slightly better esports gaming laptop for sure. But the performance is going to be fantastic on either laptop. So if you want to use an external esports gaming display for your esports sessions with the GT77 Titan, then that's obviously a great option as well. But I personally prefer that my laptop display is a fast response rate display, because that does help boost your overall experience. And so the important thing to keep in mind too is that on the GT77 Titan, you're really going to be playing most of your games in 4K, right? Because you have a 4K display. You probably want to play it natively at 4K. We're doing all these tests at the same resolution at QHD+, so that way they're fair. But so we're moving on to Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and it's such an interesting game because this is a memory-sensitive game, and yet we got so much higher FPS on the GT77. Yeah. I'm thinking it's related to the GPU just being higher levels of performance. We have ray tracing on, we have DLSS on quality, we're at QHD plus, and we're on highest settings for this test. And we are getting 100% GPU utilization here. So that's really great. But it's just, I guess it's just, you're going to see more of that memory speed difference if we were to be doing these tests at 1080p rather than QHD, because it does appear that we're GPU bound, right, in this game. And if we become CPU bound, that's when the memory speeds can really kick in and help boost FPS between these two laptops. That's my summary basically of why we're getting higher performance. Now, if you want to get a decent representation of how much better looking the Titan display is, look at these images side by side here. And this is kind of close to what you're going to experience actually looking at the images. Notice that the blacks and darks over here on the right are darker, and that the greens are a little bit greener and a little bit more vibrant. That's basically the biggest things. And then the whites, the light bright areas are also, it's a little bit punchier. You know, it's a little more high dynamic range. Like the whites here are very punchy. The blacks are very dark. And over here, it's just not quite as punchy white and not quite as dark. So that's a good example of the display quality, I think, that you can kind of expect between these two laptops. It obviously looks really good on both laptops, but when you see them side by side, you can definitely tell the Titan is a little bit higher quality display. But they're obviously both excellent. So anyway, moving on. So we're getting a bit higher FPS, about 20 FPS higher right now on the GT77, 135 to 150. And this is simply that factory OC with the GT77 Titan. And if we were to apply our own overclock to both of these laptops to the peak, we would see, I believe, an even bigger difference between the GT77 Titan and the Scar 18, because the Scar 18 does have a slight overclock on it already during these tests out of the box. So, and the GT77 base clock does allow it to boost even further. So you can see that we got 151 on the Scar 18 and 169 for the GT77, which is super interesting to me. We did have updated drivers though on the GT77, so keep that in mind for all of these tests. We did the best drivers available to us when we did the tests. So all right, Scar 18 versus the GT77 QHD Plus gaming benchmarks test. The purple is the Scar 18, the red is the GT77. So Shadow of the Tomb Raider, GT77 wins. Apex Legends, it was a tie. Hogwarts Legacy, Scar 18 takes it. CSGO, the GT77 takes it. God of War, GT77. Watch Dogs Legion, GT77. Cyberpunk 2077, Scar 18. Warzone 2 is basically a tie. Dead Space on Ultra, DLSS and quality, we have the GT77 winning that. And then Dying Light 2, Scar 18. So after averaging all of these results, what do we get? The GT77 is 3% faster when averaging all of these results. So overall, obviously fantastic performance on both of these laptops, and the Scar 18 is going to be cheaper and be a bit more portable. Well, the GT77 has that better display and mechanical keyboard. So if a better display and mechanical keyboard is highly desirable for you, then I think the GT77 could be worth the extra money. But if you're an esports gamer and you want something a little more portable, I do think the Scar 18 is a superb option. Both these laptops are really awesome. So it's hard for me to like say you're necessarily going wrong one versus the other. The value is obviously a little better with the Scar 18 being cheaper, but you also, you're not getting the same feature set, right? The feature set with the 4K 144 hertz display, that's something special. We haven't seen that before, right? That's a very high-end display in a gaming laptop. And the brightness, the contrast, the color gamut, it is better. And that's part of the factoring in of the price difference, right? And then the additional ports that you're getting on the GT77 and the SSD upgradability, all of those things do matter, but only if they matter to you, right? Because that's the key. Like when you're debating between one laptop versus another, if you don't care about esports gaming, then I think the GT77 is the better choice, not factoring in price. But if you're someone that loves esports games or really wants a QHD 240 hertz display instead for optimizing higher frame rates just in general and better future proofing, because it is harder to push 4K frames, right, in terms of casual games and other things. So if you're someone who wants to have better future proofing, you want to keep this laptop for 5 to 10 years, the Scar 18 is more likely to have better future frame rates at the native resolution. So it does depend on what your target desirability and use case is. And I do think the mechanical keyboard is noticeably better, right, in terms of typing experience. So if you're a mechanical keyboard nut, the Scar 18 unfortunately does not offer mechanical keyboard anymore. That's too bad. They did in 2021. The optical mechanical keyboard was really great. It's not there anymore. So there is more value, I think, in the GT77 that makes it equal the price increase, but only if you care about those upgrades. So that's my summary difference between the GT77 and the Scar 18. I hope that adds some clarity to you, to anyone that's trying to decide between these two laptops. I've got a ton of new content coming up. I've got an Omen 17 with a 4090 coming in. I've got the Gigabyte G5, which I just did a test with this yesterday. So if you haven't seen what a RTX 4060 can do, hop over to that live stream and check that out. And I've got a Zephyrus G16 that'll be benchmarking later, probably tomorrow. Unboxing and benchmarking either tomorrow or the next day. Probably Monday is probably when that's going to happen. And then I've got, like, I don't know, MSI Pulse 15, the Zephyrus Duo 16 coming in. There's the Scar 17, the Scar 16. I do really want to do the Zephyrus G14 as well. So there are just so many laptops that I already have like in the production schedule. And if you don't want to miss out on those reviews, unboxings, live streams, and benchmark comparison battling between all of these different laptops, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you can tune in when I'm doing it live and you can ask me questions or whatever. So I do interact with chat. If you guys want to stop by any of those live streams, it'd be awesome. All right, so that's it for this. Like this is a pseudo live. I'm doing this all in one take, so I know that I messed up some parts. I might end up cutting some of those out in post in YouTube, but it's going to take a little time for those changes to apply. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. I will see you in the next one. Brandon, out. Huzzah.